Hold your breath. Make a wish. Count to 3. Come with me, and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look, and you'll see into your imagination. A little less nerve-wracking in the shower. That song, Pure Imagination, comes from the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. That song goes on to say, want to change the world? There's nothing to it. That movie and that song, they tap into something very human. As humans, we long to live in a world of possibilities, a world of pure imagination, a world where gobstoppers never lose their flavor, a world where elevators can go sideways and slantways and longways and backways and any other ways you can think of. A world where the only constraints to creativity are the limits of our imaginations. We might take a hard pass on the Oompa Loompas, but there's something about a world of abundance that feels right. The story of the Bible is the story of a God that makes a world of possibilities, a world of abundance. And then sin messes everything up. Instead of living lives of abundance, sin has made it so that our world is marred by scarcity. Our world is now often plagued by fear, the fear that there will not be enough. But that is not how God made us to live. God did not make us to live lives of scarcity. He didn't make us to live fearful and self-protective. He made us to live lives of security and love. God made us to live lives of abundance. So the question that Leviticus 18 and 19 will help us to answer is this: how do we live lives of abundance in a world marred by scarcity? This is kind of a part 2 to Jeff's message last Sunday. So you might recall that we've turned something of a corner in Leviticus. The symbolic, the ritual holiness has kind of receded to the background. We heard a little bit of it in our passage today, but the focus really now is towards the moral and towards ethical holiness. A moral and ethical holiness that flows from our relationship with God. Israel belonged to God. He brought them out of the land of Egypt and out of the land of scarcity, and was leading them into the land of Canaan, a land of abundance. And because they belonged to God, because they had this new identity, they were called to live distinctly. God placed his name upon Israel, that they might learn to live lives from a place of abundance rather than from a place of scarcity. We see this in 18:3 if you look at your bulletin. God says to Israel, "You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you." The commands that God will lay out for Israel in this passage is the way that they are to live lives of holiness and love. God is defining the relationship for Israel. This is how their relationship with him should make a difference in their everyday lives. When Chelsea and I went on our honeymoon, we just celebrated 13 years of marriage. So when we went on our honeymoon, looking back on these days and what it was like for us, we were down just south of Cancun, where you sit by the pool, and we'd kind of talk about what we wanted our new life together to look like. If you're married or you're thinking about getting married, you've probably had those kind of conversations too. How do we want our relationship to be distinct? These kind of conversations are sprawling, right? They touch on all of the different aspects of our lives. They talk about finances and work. How is our new life together going to be different? How is it going to be distinct from our families of origin? How is it going to be our new life? And that's what God is doing with Israel in these chapters of Leviticus. He is saying to Israel, "You belong to me. And because you belong to me, this is how you are to be distinct. You shall be distinctly mine by the way you treat one another, by the way you care for the most vulnerable of society, by the way you live lives of integrity, by the way that you love." God is defining the relationship, telling Israel not to conform to the ways of Egypt, neither to the ways of Canaan. They aren't supposed to be like everybody else. They are to be distinct. They are to be holy. Holiness sometimes gets a bad rap. We don't use that word so much in our culture. The only real cultural reference that I could come up with was a Justin Bieber song, so I don't think that's helping us any. But even if it's not the most common word, holy does conjure up certain images and feelings. Holiness maybe brings up images of being sequestered from society. We think of monks and nuns. They live together, they're often separated from society. Or if you've been around maybe evangelical churches in the past 30, 40 years, holiness might bring up feelings of control. For some Christians, holiness has been more about what people shouldn't do rather than listening carefully to what God calls us to do. But holiness is awesome. Holiness is what a life of abundance looks like. Holiness, it's not about detaching from society. It's not about being distinct for the sake of distinctness. It's not about avoiding movie theaters, avoiding dancing, not reading Harry Potter. No, holiness is about living a life of love. This whole section in Leviticus could be summarized by the command found in verse 18 of our passage, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Holiness looks like love. Jesus himself says that this is the second most important command in all the Bible. The only thing that comes before it is loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. The God of all abundance, the God who blesses his people with every spiritual blessing, as we heard from our call to worship, the God who is in himself holy, has brought us into a relationship with him that we too might live distinctly. Not because he wants to control us, but because he wants us to be free. He wants us to live lives of abundance rather than lives of scarcity. And we can see this really clearly in Israel's story. Imagine what it would be like for an entire nation of people to be brought out of a land of scarcity and into a land of abundance. Imagine what it would look like if an entire nation lived from a place of abundance rather than from a place of scarcity. How wonderful would that be? Think of the possibilities. Instead of people being tight-fisted with resources, just clinging to things for themselves, they lived open-handedly for the good of those most in need. And instead of people feeling the need to do whatever is necessary to get ahead, people prioritized integrity over profits. Instead of living lives of fear, people would find their hope and their abundance in God rather than their possessions. This is the kind of life that God was calling Israel to live. He brought them out of Egypt and was bringing them into the promised land, the land of abundance, to live lives of holiness, lives of love. We don't know personally what it's like to live in Egypt or Canaan. We don't exactly know the temptations that Israel felt to just kind of blend into society, to look like everybody else. But we know what it's like to fear that there won't be enough. We know what it's like to feel that pull to just kind of blend in, to not do the things that God calls us to do. You know, for the past 2 weeks, millions of Americans have been in limbo as to whether or not they would have food benefits or not. We might not be able to just like copy and paste the commands that we'll look at onto our lives. But we still very much live in a world marred by sin and scarcity. And so the temptation to live with our guard up all the time isn't just Israel's, it's ours too. We know what it feels like to be afraid that there will not be enough. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that God's commands are challenging. They're challenging because they call us to do something that makes us uncomfortable. They require us to be vulnerable. They require us to give up self-protective strategies and learn to love. C.S. Lewis says this about love. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it up carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Lewis is saying our self-protective strategies are effective in some ways. They do keep us from some things. And we'll see that truth is reflected in the commands that God gave to Israel. There are certain things that you can keep for yourselves. But what we'll also see is that fear and scarcity cannot give us what we most deeply want. Because what we most deeply want is love. God's call to holiness, God's call to love, that is the kind of life that we long for. So what we'll do now is look at just a few of the commands that God gave to Israel to see how they move us from scarcity towards the God of all abundance. One of the ways that Israel was called to be holy as the Lord their God is holy was in their care for the poor. If you look at your bulletin in verse 9, God says, "You shall not reap your fields right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest." Israel lived in an agrarian society, and in that society, land was a source of security. So God is commanding them to forego some personal security so that way the poor can be cared for. What this looked like practically was that at least one edge of an Israelite's field was to be left untouched during the harvest. They were not to reap the entire field for themselves. Instead, the untouched harvest and anything that fell to the ground was meant for the poor and the sojourner. God was commanding his people to plan to have margins for those in need. So holiness looks like not pursuing maximum profit for ourselves. Holiness looks like planning to live under one's means so that the most vulnerable in society can be cared for. The wisdom of this command is really quite profound. Material needs are going to be met, right? The poor, the sojourner, they're going to get food. They're not going to go hungry. But it goes deeper than that too. The command says that the poor and the sojourners are actually the ones that are meant to harvest the grain, to harvest the margin, which means that they will have the dignity that comes from picking the food for themselves. So there's a structure in place. There's a structure in place that gives them access to what they need, and they get to earn their own food. The holiness that God calls us to gives dignity, and it flows from generosity. But it's a struggle to live under one's means. You know, we think of our own lives, we think of inflation, we think of tariffs, we think of the holidays coming up, and living under our means sounds kind of fanciful. But the question that I think we need to return to as God's people over and over again is, are we being conformed to a society marred by scarcity, or are we being transformed by the God of all abundance? Think of things that we as a church are seeking to do, like the Haiti Initiative, right? Or you think of other organizations that care for people holistically. Holiness, right? To pursue holiness means that we give thought and careful planning to meet the needs of those around us, both material and spiritual. Let's look at the second way that Israel was called to be holy. It's related to telling the truth. In verses 11 and 12, there are commands about lying, theft, and deception. The point is that because God's people bear his name, they also need to evidence his character. God never lies. God is trustworthy and true. He is totally reliable. So people who bear God's name, who call on his name, who are in a relationship with him, who belong to him, are called to be truthful. Holiness looks like being people of character and integrity. The last command listed in verse 12 gets at this really clearly. It says, "You shall not swear by my name falsely." And the reason given is because you will profane the name of your God. Originally, this referred to swearing an oath on God's name when a crime was committed without witnesses. Someone would say, something like, "As the Lord lives, I did not do such and such thing." And it would be, very easy to lie in this kind of situation, right? Another way to kind of protect yourself. And it might seem advantageous to do this. You might be able to get away with something, right? If you invoke God's name, the logic of it is pretty clever. Why? You're appealing to God's character. You're basically saying, well, God is trustworthy, and I'm connected to God, therefore you can believe me. Which is, of course, a heinous thing to do. It's a heinous way to hide wrongdoing. This type of thing goes on in our world all the time. We have forensics, right? So it's not exactly the same kind of situation. We don't have sort of the same testimony as they did. But people still use God's name as a cover-up for evil. People still hide behind a cloak of religion for personal gain. Think of like televangelists. Think of the numerous scandals of abuse and power that have happened in the church. These things are particularly devastating. When someone claims God's name and character as a cover-up for harm, it causes significant damage. So holiness looks like being people of integrity, people who tell the truth, people who bear God's name not perfectly, but honestly. More specifically to this command, holiness looks like holding leadership to a high standard, not by being suspicious and cynical, but rather by implementing structures and systems of accountability, structures and systems that have real consequences for those who do harm in God's name. The third way that God calls Israel to be holy that we'll look at this morning is in business practices. Verse 13 says, "The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until morning." This command is about the exploitation of a day laborer. What's going on here is that someone hires a day laborer and promises to pay them a specific wage. Right? A day laborer is someone who, by definition, is in a vulnerable spot. They're living day by day, paycheck to paycheck. So when the day is done, the boss says, "Oh, I'm sorry, but I can't pay you until tomorrow." The implication being that when tomorrow comes, he can just say the same thing again. If you keep reading on to verse 14, there's something of like a maxim that's given that underscores the point. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You know, if you curse the deaf, they won't hear it. If you put a stumbling block in front of the blind, they won't be able to see it. So there's something about trickery going on here. To trick a day laborer or to trick a blind person is to exploit their vulnerability for your own gain. The blind person trips, you get a laugh at them. You get a hard day's labor out of someone, and you don't pay them a single cent. Haha, I bested you. But love does not do this. Holiness does not exploit others for personal gain. Holiness, as we've already seen, looks out for the vulnerable. Holiness seeks to give dignity to those in need. Holiness is less concerned about how much I can get for myself and more concerned about what someone else simply needs. One of the best real-life examples that I know of this comes back from like 2008 when the housing market went under. I know someone who owns a construction business, and he had, I don't know, like 8 guys working for him. And the builder that this owner was working for told him that he wasn't going to pay him for all of the work that he did. He did tons of work on commercial properties. Said, we're not going to pay you. So the business owner sued, right, as he should. He sued this man, but those things take a very long time to resolve. And so in the meantime, what he did was pay his guys out of his own pocket. He ate the cost so that his guys would be compensated. That is the kind of holiness that God calls his people to. There's a lot of overlap in these commands, isn't there? You know, we could keep going on. We could keep looking at command after command after command, and what we would see is that each time, fear and scarcity and love and abundance are at war with one another. When the Apostle Paul quotes God's command to love your neighbor as yourself, he says this: "The desires of the flesh are against the desires of the Spirit. The desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. They are at war with one another." The man-made strategies of self-protection move us away from love. They promise to keep us safe, but as we've seen, it's at the expense of others. And in truth, it's at the expense of ourselves. Scarcity and fear, they keep us from love. Israel had moments when they lived distinct and holy lives. One standout was Boaz, who allowed Ruth to glean in his fields. But by and large, Israel did not hold up their end of the marriage. They didn't hold up their end of belonging to God. They didn't stick to the way that God laid out for their new life together. More often than not, they conformed to the nations around them. They heard the whispers of scarcity in their ear. And so, like Adam and Eve before them, eventually they were kicked out of the land of abundance. As we've already said, the greatest hindrance to holiness is fear. Specifically, the fear that there will not be enough. Think about some of the commands that we've looked at already. Why would someone harvest all their grain and make sure every last piece of it was picked up? For fear of what the next harvest may or may not bring. Why do people make underhanded business decisions? For fear that that's what it takes to get ahead of everybody else, to just keep up with everybody else. I have to do what everyone else in society is doing. Scarcity is the enemy of holiness, because scarcity leads us away from trusting God. Scarcity is why Adam and Eve worried that God was holding out on them. Scarcity is why Israel so often lived indistinguishable from Egypt and Canaan. But what's kind of wonderful about that isn't that we struggle to trust God. It's not wonderful that we feel this fear too, that we know what this is like. What's wonderful is that scarcity doesn't stop God's abundance. It reveals it in Jesus all the more. The God of all abundance sent Jesus into a world marred by sin and scarcity. Jesus left the glories and the riches and the abundance, the comforts of heaven, and became a human being. He became one of us. He became our neighbor. And he lived not in this self-protective posture, this looking out for me posture, but he lived in an open and in a generous posture. He lived a life of holiness and love. He multiplied food for those in need. He turned over the tables of those who profane God's name in God's house. And on the cross, he had his arms literally pulled open wide in a posture that is nothing but open, nothing but vulnerable. Right? In a moment when all of us would go like this, his arms were stretched out wide. He said, "Here are my hands, here are my feet. My life for your life. My life of abundance for your life of scarcity. My life of holiness for your life of lack." The God of all abundance sent Jesus to us because he is the holiness that we need. He is the abundance that we need. The point of all that God was trying to teach Adam and Eve and all that God was trying to teach Israel, all that God is trying to teach us, is that the abundance that we need is not found so much in the land. The abundance we need is found in him. He is the one that makes holiness possible.